of it, most of the time, it's
Yeah, I was just gonna respond to that and say, there's probably like a gray area where we can kind of realize that maybe we have certain propensities toward certain things that could be genetic, but there's certainly room to work with it and to just, you can try to guide your life to avoid certain situations and things and develop the right kinds of habits and stuff, but just to decide, oh, I'm screwed for life because of my genes, that's definitely not a good attitude to take.
Yeah, interestingly, that is, I mean, this sort of dawned on me this summer when I was going from evolutionary psychology to Sartre, is that's actually one place where they agree, because none of the evolutionary, like I said, none of the evolutionary psychologists are genetic determinists, and what they would say is that most people are going to have certain predispositions to some degree, but none of them say, and therefore you cannot avoid acting on them. They all say, no, you can decide you don't want to act on that feeling. And so I guess Sartre and the evolutionary psychologists are in agreement there. Just because you have a tendency doesn't somehow force you to act on it.
Right. And just having awareness of things is helpful. Being able to sort of see certain patterns and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the messages of evolutionary psychology might be, at least this is the way I interpreted it in my life, was don't be so hard on yourself. If you have certain feelings, it's not like that doesn't necessarily make you a bad person just because you have certain feelings and desires. Even if they're, socially unacceptable desires, there may be a reason why you have those. And so it's not like, well, I somehow am a bad person because I have this feeling. I might be a bad person if I act on it, but just because, for example, just because I have certain racially prejudiced emotions, because I grew up in southern New Mexico, that when I see certain people, it's not as bad as it used to be, so it has gotten somewhat better, but that I have sort of an immediate knee-jerk prejudicial feeling, that doesn't make me a bad person. It just means, okay, great. I'm not, or maybe not so great. I've got certain feelings I don't really like having, but it doesn't, it can help. I think they think it can help explaining why we have some of these, can relieve some of the pressure, and self-condemnation and so on.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Like I said in that one conversation we were having, like I feel as though I'm not really the author of the thoughts that come into my mind much of the time, and so I can't really get down on myself about certain thoughts or feelings that I have, but it does, and again, I'm not sure about this, but it feels as though perhaps I have some sort of choice, or maybe there's just something else controlling the choices that I make, to not act on those particular thoughts. And so, yeah, you shouldn't think that the thoughts that come into your mind have anything to do with your character as a human being. So.
Yeah, that's a big thing in Buddhism.
Go ahead. I was going to say that too. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think what's kind of going on in terms of that is there's something sort of different regarding I don't know. I think the role of consciousness itself allows some kind of sway in how we can choose those different alternatives, whatnot, no matter what I feel like there's definitely some kind of a limitation in terms of, what you're given, or the facticity or whatnot. It's kind of like being given, a palette, and you're given these certain colors, or a canvas and a certain palette and certain colors, but then you have some kind of way of expressing it that aren't just determined by the colors you're given on the palette and the canvas and whatnot. there's still some act of creation that, by reflecting on what those options are with what you've got, that allows for something that exceeds just the givenness of whatever you're given, whether it's biological or social or psychological. There's something that's being created ultimately in the present just by action alone that exceeds whatever was given in the past, although it's using the past in some way. So that's my take on it.
Yeah,
I like that idea, and I'm totally open to that.
Excellent. I've convinced you. Yes.
There's a passage in Zarathustra where Zarathustra is apparently, as my advisor told me, there's a parody of the Gospels. A parody not in the sense of making fun of it, but in a sense of sort of an alternative account. And there's this passage, Jesus healed people various places. There's this one place in Zarathustra where there's a hunchback, and I think I don't know if I can't remember if somebody asks him why he didn't heal the hunchback, or if the hunchback asks him to heal him. But what Zarathustra's response is, that's what makes you who and what you are. And your task is, pretty much like Chase said, your task is to create a life of meaning and value given that, facticity or whatever the facts of your life are. So, yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing to say, but it may be right, because sometimes the facts that people have to deal with are difficult, like being a hunchback. But what else are you going to do? What other choice I guess you could just be like Chase's friend and go, hey, fuck God, you made me a hunchback. Well,
yeah, fuck God.
How far are you going to get with that?
Or he's not even like mad at God, because he definitely doesn't believe in God. He's just like mad at his parents for reproducing and like bringing him into the world with shitty genes. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. I don't know.
With Madeline, with the thoughts thing, like Chase mentioned Buddhism, and I tend to get a little evangelical sometimes, so I apologize. But that's one of the disciplines in at least in Zen and meditation, is watching things go by, both in the external senses, but also in the mind, and just watching stuff go by, and there's by like clouds without, and try not to attach to them. We tend to, but then when you discover you've grabbed one, just kind of let it go and let it float by. And so you just kind of and rather than identifying these thoughts as features of of my identity, defining who I am, just they're like, one guy said something like, the mind secretes thoughts like the gallbladder secretes bile. And so it's just like, that's what the mind does. It just sits there and cranks thoughts out, which, sort of refutes a lot of stuff I was saying perhaps in our conversation on Facebook about this. But then, so then you find thoughts, I don't know if Chase has had this happen, but I've had thoughts float by. It's like, oh my God, where did that one come from? Pretty awful thoughts. But rather than, saying, wow, that must mean I'm a terrible person, I'm just like, wow, that was a really weird thought. Let that one go.
Yeah, it's definitely good to add some distance from your thinking. I read this one book that was talking about visualizing thoughts as coming from what is the term used, like a senate of different people, that basically all the people you've met, all of your thoughts essentially come from some kind of a representation of one of those people, or a kind of fabulation of combinations of them, that ultimately no thought comes from a voice of your own. It's basically a voice of someone else, usually like a family member or a friend or whatnot. And that's basically them speaking to you. And really the best thing to do is to try to identify that voice rather than to identify with it.
That makes
That's
sense. So
obviously
do we all have some form of dissociative identity disorder?
correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, I have, like you were saying, David, about having a thought that comes in, you're like, where the hell did that come from? Like, that was a really evil thing to think. It's like the part of me that thinks that about that thought, it really feels like there's two different entities within me. So I've sort of had that experience before.
Well, you know, I think I may have mentioned this in our Facebook conversation. You know, Nietzsche, you know, he reduced. I mean, maybe maybe he's too much of a reductionist, but he reduces everything to wills to power, and in the human organism that ends up being, you know, drives and feelings and instincts. And he's actually borrowing from Plato here that the soul is this kind of community in the good sense, but it's often a battleground of all these different drives and motives and feelings. And Nietzsche makes the claim that thoughts are actually kind of an epiphenomenon that ride on top of this underlying set of conflicts. And he thinks by this point in history, pretty much everybody, you know, he speculates that maybe in the far, far distant past, people had more unified, cohesive psychological lives because there hadn't been so much cross-cultural experience and so on. So there was more of a, you know, we all think this way, and this is, you know, and we all just grew up with this sort of coherent set of beliefs and motives. But by this time, he thinks most of us are just constituted by an underlying battle of these biological forces, which then emerge as psychological, psychological forces. And so that as he says, it's something like a society of drives and instincts and so on. And so, you know, I feel that myself a lot, where I feel just tremendous conflict as to what I should do about this or what I should do about that. And, you know, and I, you know, and I mean, you get little senses of Freud from that as well, you know, all that underlying stuff going on. So I don't know that that's necessarily a sign of, it may be more a sign of psychological insight and introspection than it is a sign of dysfunction or a pathology. That may be more just of an insight into what's kind of going on under the hood.
That makes sense. Good old Nietzsche.
So, yeah. Yep. Well, I guess.
Well, I kind of wish Hunter was here, considering this section of the reading, because I feel like he would have some insight into this nothingness business going on here.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, because I really would like to kind of know how Bergson's critique of nothingness would compare with Sartre's use of that word and with Heidegger's use of that word. But unfortunately, I mean, I know Heidegger even less than Sartre on that topic, and I don't know Sartre really much at all. So,
well, luckily, I reread Heidegger's lecture, What is Metaphysics?, where he talks about the nihilation of the nothing yesterday, because I have a reading group I go to an hour after this one ends that's covering it.
Great.
So I've got that pretty fresh in my mind, and I think I could give a comparison. But Sartre, I don't know quite as well. That's why Hunter would have been helpful, but oh well.
Well, I don't, So, the only thing and this is so vague as to maybe be useless, is I remember reading things about, Sartre talking about the density of being, that like being, pure being is this, because we've been reading Bergson, I tend to want to interpret it in terms of Bergson, which could be a big mistake, but how Bergson talks about matter is this sort of weight of determinism, and consciousness is this kind of counterposing movement of freedom. When Sartre says things like talks about the density of being, and then consciousness is like nothing in the sense that it cuts into, it breaks into the density of being, and sort of, I imagine just sort of a wedge, cutting into this dense block and opening up spaces for consciousness. But I may be just too influenced by our reading of Bergson.
Yeah, that's hard to figure out exactly how Sartre would relate to that. I know that Sartre read Bergson and was influenced by him, especially early on, but then he obviously then got into more the German phenomenologists like Husserl and Heidegger, and then was more influenced by them, obviously. But he read Bergson, and I think there's definitely some kind of an influence there.
So maybe so I'm not sure what to do. Should we try to get an overview of Bergson's idea of nothing, and then then Chase, maybe you could help us. Or what I'm curious is how much his analysis applies to Heidegger's notion, or how similar or different they are. I kind of got bogged down, or not. I don't know if bogged down. When Bergson goes through all these different ways that we come up with this illusion of nothing, after a while that seemed to me a little tedious. But I thought the general notion that nothing is again, it'd be interesting to see what Heidegger says, but that nothing is really is a meaningless term ultimately, at least in the metaphysical sense, seemed to be fairly compelling to me.
Yeah, I think so. Pretty much what he's saying here is that the idea of nothing is this kind of intellectual operation that really is actually talking about a relative substitution, instead of, it's basically like these different intellectual acts where when you encounter something that you didn't expect to encounter, say, then you're noting that, and what's really going on is that you're substituting a kind of indefinite, you're not saying that there's nothing exactly by saying, the table is not white or whatever, but instead you're kind of putting an indefinite deferral into the future for another something. And so that seems to be what he's saying, and from that we get the idea of an absolute nothing from a kind of combination of all those possible ideas, that because we can have specific acts of negation against any one particular thing, then we kind of add that up in our imagination and get this general idea of nothingness. So that seemed to be pretty much what he was saying, which is actually very similar to the way that Heidegger critiques the notion of nothingness as an idea or an intellectual concept, and especially the logical account of negation. He basically says all of those miss the mark of what nothingness actually is. So I think it's interesting because in a way they're kind of agreeing on their critique. It's just that Heidegger goes on to say, actually, there's not just this intellectual operation about nothingness. We actually encounter it in the way that so ultimately he's going to say that first, in order to get nothingness, you have to understand like the totality of all beings, and that this totality is given not by like these additions, these or hypothetical additions of everything put together. You know, he says that is a part of the idea of it, but he says basically in our attitude and our comportment to the world of beings as a total, which is kind of something that's constantly going on in the way that we just actually live and interact with a world, that we have some kind of a preliminary, not idea, but a preliminary engagement with beings as a totality. And the idea of nothingness is kind of this space or this transcendental ground, in a sense, that allows for that presencing to happen. It's something like that. So I wondered, is Bergson is critical of, you know, these intellectual accounts of these things, and he supports this idea of a intuition that can experience the absolute. It can make contact with the absolute. That sounds pretty similar to what Heidegger is saying, just there's an extra kind of step there, in the sense of Heidegger's then saying there has to be a ground for that presencing, and that is the nothingness ultimately. So that seems to be where they contradict each other, but I'm not so sure that Bergson's idea, I kind of agree more with Heidegger in the sense that I think Bergson is just kind of limiting this idea to that very limited intellectual operation of relative negations and whatnot. And that, yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of problems in philosophy and metaphysics because people have basically taken that idea and turned into this abstract idea of the nothingness. And that really, in a kind of encounter with this this engagement of beings as a total, that nothingness kind of gives, and well, Heidegger talks about it as existential anxiety, that it's a kind of mood that you're encountered with and is kind of always in the background, but we sort of distract ourselves from it constantly by engaging in all these particular things and whatnot. I definitely think there's something to that, and I think Bergson, yeah, he's I don't think he goes far enough by getting to any kind of a real nothingness. He's just engaging here with this idea of it, which I think his critique of the idea works, but I don't think he's exhausting nothingness itself, really.
I guess I don't see why. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read that, and I don't know Heidegger. I don't see why there would have to be a background of nothing for beings to, I don't know what to say, emerge from. It's, you know, I mean, and what you describe sounds to me similar to what Bergson says on page 296, he's talking about the idea of absolute nothing. And at the bottom of the top paragraph, he says, it is therefore an idea eminently comprehensive and full and comprehensive as the idea of all, to which it is very close akin. How then can the idea of not be opposed to that of all? Is it not plain that this is to oppose the full to the full, and that the question, why does something exist is consequently without meaning? And I can't remember if it was Merleau-Ponty or if it was Whitehead, but I seem to remember we got into a similar discussion where someone we were reading was saying, or maybe it was in that 19th century class when we were talking about Hegel, but that the idea of complete nothing and the idea of like absolute nothing and absolute being are the same idea, because they are both the idea of an undifferentiated totality. And so, and I'm not sure I'm understanding, what you're saying about Heidegger, but if there, I'm kind of having that same problem that as an idea, I don't see the difference between an undifferentiated totality between nothing and everything, a totality of being versus no being at all. They're both just sort of an undifferentiated totality. But maybe that's not what Heidegger means.
Yes, I think you're referring to Merleau-Ponty, where he's kind of critiquing Sartre by saying exactly that this dualistic totality of these different things, that ultimately they come down to the same idea. So yeah, Merleau-Ponty actually he criticizes Bergson on a similar idea. Although according to one thing I read, Merleau-Ponty doesn't, his criticism of Bergson isn't really that fair, and he makes a lot of mistakes, but, well, I guess we can get to that specifically if it comes up, but, so I think, so I did read this one kind of secondary source thing, that went over Merleau-Ponty's kind of account of Bergson and whatnot, and it definitely helped kind of give me some idea of what was going on there. So basically what Merleau-Ponty was saying about Bergson was that actually he is using a kind of negativity in his ideas. Like he talks about, okay, what is matter? It's an interruption, He talks about the mathematical order as nothing positive, that these things are, kind of, they're not exactly illusions, but they're not full realities in some sense, that they're these kind of like stop motion animations that are just partial views. And Merleau-Ponty is basically saying that partiality that is all over Bergson's philosophy, that the idea of, interruptions, and even the idea of the detention and whatnot, all those ideas have some aspect of negativity in them, and that's what makes it work. Where if there was just simply like pure positivity, total coincidence, total fusion, then his account of duration, how would duration happen, and something like that. And that's why he says you have to have simultaneously a principle of unity and also a principle of differentiation simultaneously. And that principle of differentiation, Merleau-Ponty, the dehiscence or whatever, has to go along. That's kind of the negative aspect, but it's a partial negativity that sort of interweaves with the positive account, which is of the connection, the flesh, and all that. So I think that's one way to see it, but then I don't think Bergson would necessarily have a problem with that. He would say, okay, yeah, those are all partial sort of views or whatnot. They're they're partial, and I don't think he has a problem with that, or like these ideas of relative negation. I think his big thing is with the idea that it's a kind of reality on its own, in a sense. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so the way, and I'm not sure this would account for all the examples that you brought up when you were talking about Merleau-Ponty, but it seems to me, one way of thinking about what Bergson is saying is that nothing is always relative, that there is only relative nothingness. So, like it's relative, like it's nothing relative to what I'm looking for. It's like, and it's not here now, but it used to be, so it's relative to something else. And that, I think it seems like what he's suggesting is there is no absolute nothing, because the absolute nothing is a meaningless concept. And again, I'm not sure this would address all the examples that you mentioned, but it does seem to address at least some of them. And so when he, like when he talks about these partial views and so on, to say, for example, that the rational mind carves the world up into discrete entities, when in fact it's a continuum. It doesn't seem to me there's any kind of that's still all positivity, it seems to me, in the sense that he's just saying it's kind of a matter of perspective. If you look at, it's kind of like if you look at this image through some kind of, some kind of device that kind of makes it look pixelated, well, it's going to look pixelated. If you look at it through a different kind of device, it's going to look continuous. But that's not to say that there's a negativity there. It's it's just one relative to the other. And then at the beginning of the book, Bergson's talks a lot about how there isn't an absolute at either end, but there's always a sort of continuum between these different ways of, thinking about or experiencing things. So and then the other thing I was thinking that especially the end of this chapter, what Bergson seems to want to say, and this is just sort of a gut feeling I've got, is that this duration, we've used these metaphors before, is like a bubbling up to, of existence. It's like duration is the emerging of the real, or something like that. And maybe somebody would say, well, what is it emerging into? Well, that would have to be the nothingness, right? And I think Bergson would say, no, it's not emerging into anything. This is just what, being is, this process of duration unfolding, but there isn't any, there doesn't have to be some nothing into which it emerges. And, I'm reminded again of this analogy we've come back to several times between, with the idea of time being a space-time domain. And then if you were to ask what is outside that, well, you can't ask that question, because outside is a spatial term. And that out there, which is, already that's a nonsense expression, is not empty space-time. It would be the nothing, but the very fact of me saying that it is nothing is reifying something that doesn't exist, because existence is captured within space-time. And so to talk as if there was something, like nothing is a oxymoron. And so I'm thinking of, Bergson drawing on a similar kind of idea, that to say that being doesn't need to emerge into something, into it, like to say it emerges into the nothing is to imagine that there's already a space that is already pre-existent, that being comes into. And maybe he would say something like that with the notion of a background, that why would things need a background of nothing in order to emerge as presence. But I'm not really sure I understand Heidegger's notion of presence very well either.
Yeah, so it seems so Merleau-Ponty is saying something different from Heidegger, definitely, because he's saying that Merleau-Ponty, Merleau-Ponty is saying about Bergson that his notions of, say perception as a kind of elimination, that's a kind of partial negativity, and that his philosophy, if he wants it to be completely positivist, then that doesn't work. And that basically those kind of, all these actions of, limitation, of detention, of these kind of negative actions, that's what Merleau-Ponty says about them, are something that breaks up the positivity and that makes his whole thing work, where you are capable of having some kind of differentiation, some kind of movement. Otherwise you just have, I imagine, like Parmenides, you just have like this one giant block and there's just nothing moving. There's just being is, and that's it. And then, well, the nothing is not, it's that whole thing. But Heidegger is saying something different in that. So he talks about, basically the formal way of talking about the question of, what is nothing, that people are right to say that doesn't make any sense in the formal way of thinking about it, because nothing obviously is not something. And he says it's not something that, see, it's impossible to talk about nothing without referring to it as a something, basically. But he sees it as instead more of an activity, this nihilation or whatever, that nothing annihilates, his famous saying that the logical positives hated. But he's basically saying that, yes, to a certain degree, this question doesn't make sense. But that's because it's not anything intellectual. It's something that you engage with in terms of your actual existence. And basically how you're open to a world of beings, plural, is because of this nothingness. And so he says that the partial acts of negation are dependent on nothingness itself. So this is kind of difficult for me to understand exactly how that works, but that's pretty much his point, except so I think the best way to understand it in a way that I like to think of it is, of course, Bergson says his question, why is there something and not nothing, that this is, a pseudo question. And I think that kind of makes sense from his point of view, or the way that he's kind of framing the argument here. But if you think about it in the sense of Heidegger as a kind of anxiety, that this is kind of where anxiety for him isn't being anxious about one particular thing. It's about indefinite existence or whatnot. It's nothing particular. It's just a feeling of kind of being separated, or a kind of repulsion from everything as a whole. And in terms of the question, why is there something and not nothing? He says basically that the nothing is, if you think about this question, why is there something and not nothing? If you start to think about nothing, you can start to actually get a kind of silhouette of something that normally, if you're just totally engaged in something, you're just thinking of different particulars. Your attention is just going from one particular to the other. But through this kind of, whatever you want to call it, a meditation or intuition or engagement with a kind of possibility of non-being or whatnot, that is what presents a kind of stage or an opening for you to think about existence as such, as for being as such. So I've always liked that question, not because I think it's necessarily like that there's, distinct metaphysical entities called nothing and another one called everything that are, running around chasing each other, which is kind of how I imagine Sartre's metaphysic kind of, but more so as a kind of like thought experiment where I'm trying to think about, what is all this? What is, you have to understand something by a kind of contrast with something that it's not. Well, what is the is not of what is? It's nothing. So that nothing presents this space in which you can see what being is. So this is obviously difficult to put into language, and I think that's why Heidegger presents it as a kind of way of engaging with the world. It's not conceptual, it's not intellectual, but that nevertheless everyone engages with it in one way or another. But yeah, does that help at all? Because that's the way I kind of see it, but I don't know. There's a lot of contradictory views between, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and Bergson and Sartre.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like I have some vague sense of what you were describing. Of course, the problem is just having read Bergson, whenever you express it in language, then particular passages from from Bergson's text pop into my mind, because many of the things you said, like literally spoke, Bergson has pretty direct rebuttals to. But then I think, it seems like a big part of your point is, well, that's because you can't really express this linguistically anyway, and if you do, that's what's going to happen. It's kind of like, like trying to talk about non-duality in a language that's completely built around duality. You're necessarily going to say things that are false. And that's kind of the sense I get, but I get has some vague, we were trying to drop into a less discursive mode and maybe get some sense. But then, of course, then the little Bergson devil sitting on my shoulder goes, you're just making that shit up.
Yeah.
I don't.
Damn Bergson devil.
Go ahead. Yeah, Bergson devil. Yeah, it'd be kind of ironic to counterpose the Bergson devil with a Heidegger angel. Somehow that seems a little perverse.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. I generally conceive of Heidegger as the little devil, and then Bergson as a kind of angel, and then Deleuze is like both of them kind of. He's like a little devil, little angel. He's kind of in the middle there. Yeah.
Yeah. With regard to the earlier stuff that you mentioned about Merleau-Ponty, so with not having, I've forgotten how you put it, a principle of differentiation or something. I mean, I thought that Bergson sort of included that in this notion of life. If you remember earlier, I think it was Travis we ended up talking about, the notion of shattering glass, and that the ramifications tend to move out in all these different directions. And Bergson talks about life that way. It's like when life impinges on matter, which is to speak it dualistically about something that is probably a single a monistic phenomena. But when these two moments move through each other, that life is necessarily, or when life manifests, so it sounds like he thinks life already has built into it a tendency toward differentiation. And then when life encounters matter, to speak not correctly, but when life runs through matter, that tendency toward differentiation creates the fragmentation of the real that we experience, and produces individuality. And then the interplay between life and matter then produces these moments, where you have moments of stasis in a species, and then moments of movement into a new species. And so it seems to me that Bergson has by describing life that way, has included a principle of differentiation in his notion of life. And then, so I guess, I don't know if that sounds like that might relate to what you were saying about, Merleau-Ponty's criticism, that he doesn't include a principle like that.
Yeah. So that was Merleau-Ponty's criticism of him. So he wrote this book that was really essentially lecture notes or something on a course on nature, where he has a bunch of stuff on Schelling and Bergson. But so what I read this from this book, Nature and Logos, which is it's mainly about Merleau-Ponty and somewhat about Whitehead, but also talks about Schelling and Bergson. But the authors in it say basically that he's not being very fair to Bergson. And I think on that point especially, I agree with them, because I think that's kind of exactly what Bergson is doing. He is kind of combining both a principle of kind of unity or connection with a principle of differentiation, because he's saying essentially what is, kind of connective and unitary about life is this kind of creative process of differentiation. And it's well, I don't want to go into the whole nuts and bolts of exactly what he says, but that's where I would disagree with Merleau-Ponty. But basically Merleau-Ponty is saying that because he's trying to kind of break up Bergson's, what he sees as positivism, by showing that he needs some kind of a negativity, where he sees the problem with Bergson's ideas as that they're nothing but a pure positivism, which he says is like something starting in the third chapter of this book, Creative Evolution, that he starts trying to put what was before, something more appropriate, into a kind of pure positivism. And that's what Merleau-Ponty is criticizing. But I think to a certain degree, I somewhat agree with Merleau-Ponty that you could see this as a kind of negation, some of the stuff that Bergson uses in his philosophy. But I think that exact stuff is also what Bergson accounts for with his notions with his critiques about, where he's saying, what we think of as negativity is always just basically another partial relative something or other. Mm-hmm. So that's where I don't know. I basically sort of agree with Merleau-Ponty, but also sort of agree with Bergson. But I disagree that Bergson did not have some kind of a account of differentiation and unity. I think that's what he's doing. I think that's it's one of the most interesting things about his philosophy.
Yeah, and I don't see that criticism of Merleau-Ponty, how that addresses Bergson's rejection of the idea of nothing. I mean, even if you know, even if Merleau-Ponty were to convince me that Bergson had an inadequate place for negativity, I'm not sure how that shows that his argument about nothing is incorrect. Again, which I think seems to me Bergson's argument can be boiled down to there are only relative nothings. There is no absolute nothing. You know, so how would a lack of a negative principle, you know, defeat that argument? I'm not sure I expressed that very carefully or clearly.
Yeah, I'm trying to look up exactly what they're saying in this book that Merleau-Ponty says about it. So basically his criticism is that the first two chapters of Creative Evolution present a kind of monism, that's also dialectical. Interesting. I'm not sure exactly what he means by that. And then the third and fourth chapter present a dualism and a emanationism. You know, the whole Neoplatonic thing. Which that's interesting because I had that intuition also, mainly because, I mean, he actually references Plotinus. But, you know, that's where you have the one, and then from the one you get these kind of degradations into other forms of existence that are kind of like these diminished forms of existence. And I saw that because I was wondering, you know, he presents life and matter as a kind of continuum of movement. And I was like, well, what is the continuum of? And he's like, consciousness. And then it's like, oh, but this consciousness also is a kind of duration, which is also kind of what life is. So it seems like it's more like you have this pure principle essentially of like a movement, life, duration, and then you get this kind of degradation or diminishment of it that is matter and, you know, the intellect and all that. So it sounded to me almost like it was kind of like an emanationism, because matter is in a sense kind of like emanating out of duration, life, consciousness, whatever. But then yeah, I don't know, it's what exactly is causing it to be diminished like that, and does that then require some kind of negativity to, you know, kind of like pry it apart, you know, where I forget which, I think you're referring to Sartre when you're talking about like this notion of, you know, like trying to like put a wedge into these solid blocks and wedge them apart. It feels like it needs something like that. And I think that's at least what Merleau-Ponty is talking about, is having like these principles of partial negativity that are very important to him, because that's basically his major critique of Bergson. But then I don't know, I have problems with that too, in the sense that it's, when you actually look at exactly what he's saying about Bergson, it usually is a kind of mischaracterization of what he's saying to a certain degree. And essentially, I don't know, it feels like these things are almost impossible to have any kind of conclusion about, because ultimately when you try to talk about nothing, in terms of the intellect, for the same reasons that, you know, all of these authors from Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, that they all talk about, you're then you're putting nothing into this symbol system where, you know, affirmation and negation are symmetrical, and nothing as a negation can only just mean like this non-existence of something. And that's not exactly what any of them are talking about, or what Merleau-Ponty is talking about is like a principle of partial negation, nor is it what Heidegger's talking about as well, whatever the hell Heidegger's talking about, his nihilation of the nothing. So altogether, everything's confusing.
You know what? When you were talking about how Merleau-Ponty thought he saw a shift later in this book, you know, one thing that I constantly struggle with in creative evolution is the tendency to make it into a kind of metaphysical dualism instead of monism. And maybe, you know, maybe what Merleau-Ponty is saying is that ultimately Bergson's unable to sustain the monism, and he starts off with the monism, and then partway through he can't sustain that anymore, and so then you end up with these sort of distinct principles. And you know, so maybe if I was to say to Merleau-Ponty, boy, I'm having a hard time thinking of this as a single, you know, as a ontological monism, Merleau-Ponty, maybe he would go, because that's really, he can't sustain that ultimately when he starts talking about some of this other stuff. So
Yeah.
maybe I'm running into the same problem Merleau-Ponty is running into without realizing it.
Yeah, so here, I'm just going to read this section of it. It sounds pretty relevant to what we're just talking about. Okay, so, basically what I was just saying about how the first two chapters, Bergson embraced the monism and a dialectical view of the relationships between life and matter. Life cannot be analyzed into two separate and distinct elements. In chapter 3, by contrast, Bergson presents both a dualism and an emanationism, which is the negation of the dualism. Matter is issued from the first element by the slackening of the latter. It is drawn from it by inversion. Merleau-Ponty next claims that this move from monism to dualism is unavoidable because, since consciousness is duration of a multiplicity of mental states, the unity that Bergson's positivism requires ultimately demands a unity beyond duration, a superconsciousness, a maximum of symmetrical interiority for the maximum of total exteriority that is matter. The concept of nature must burst and yield its place to God. So,
I'm not sure.
yeah, some of that, I remember even when I read this last night, I was kind of like, what? Symmetrical interiority? Well, I sort of get that, but yeah, some of this, I think that's basically Merleau-Ponty's criticism. I'm not sure exactly I understand it totally, but I kind of see what he's getting at in terms of basically like the problems we see somewhat with like this, like how does he exactly avoid the emanationism? You know, why is there detention of movement? Why is there this fluctuation, this oscillation at all? Merleau-Ponty is basically saying that that's because he focuses too much ultimately on trying to put this all back into a kind of positivism and this one principle, and that's why he has to come up with like super consciousness. So I could kind of see that. I don't know, this is very hard to explain, but it's basically, you know, without some kind of principle of negativity kind of embedded in what we can call positivity, without those kind of dual motions together, then it's hard to explain, you know, how he comes up with this whole metaphysics where you do have dual motions, where you do have contraction, only because you also have detention. And Merleau-Ponty is saying that ultimately that's why he has to put all this fluctuating duality into this one thing back together, because he's committed to this positivism, and he has to deny the negative aspect that comes with his whole idea, the idea that of, you know, limitation and detention and reduction and limitation, all these things. He has to basically put it back into this consciousness, super consciousness, to stay committed to this idea of a total positivism. But then he's saying that basically that total positivism then is a kind of stasis, and there's no longer then a sort of principle of differentiation, I guess, between that. I'm not sure. I'm kind of just like trying to make sense of this, where
Yeah. My questions about that, I think there's a really good chance, or just because I don't really understand what he's saying, you know, I mean, because what I want to ask is why can't Bergson just say that these are principles immanent, you know, within the matter life, whatever, ontological stuff. You know, I don't know why you need a more comprehensive principle, but I'm guessing I don't understand that because I don't understand the criticism well, is my suspicion.
yeah. So one thing about Bergson, it is kind of strange, is I think so part of the problem is that he has this kind of sort of dual motion ontology, I guess you could call it, but it kind of needs it needs to be a dual motion of something. And I think the problem is really coming up with that, where he's trying to, you know, what is this a dual motion of? Because it seems to be, I think the problem is trying to put it into a monism. And then that's where, you know, he says consciousness plays that role, but then he's just like, well, but by consciousness, I don't really mean consciousness. So then it's like, okay, well, what do you mean then?
Yeah, but you know, I wonder if Bergson would say that's trying to step behind, you know, looking for some metaphysical principle behind, I don't know, what we can actually experience or something like that. So, you know, it's kind of like you know, like some religious believers will say, well, there has to be a first cause, and so that would be God. But then you ask, well, what would be the cause of God? Well, there isn't one because you stop with God, but why? You know, what would, and so, you know, maybe Bergson would say, well, why does there have to be, or I'm thinking in sort of almost a phenomenological way here. You know, if we're gonna talk about what we can experience, and I guess in Bergson's case, either through the intellect or intuition, and then give a plausible account of that, then to say there must be something behind that. I mean, you know, I could imagine Bergson saying, well, why does there have to be something behind that? And if there was, could we say anything about it anyway? So, you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, you know, like sort of like criticisms that Nietzsche and some people have of metaphysics is that you're trying to, or even Wittgenstein, you know, you're trying to talk about things you have no way of conceiving or experiencing or anything.
Yeah, I think so. I guess one way to better articulate it would be, um, what exactly is the principle of unity that allows these different movements, these different tendencies to actually, you know, interact with each other or to express themselves in one way or the other, that they have to be of some kind of commonality in some aspect in order for them to express themselves in a way that's connected with each other. So it's kind of like, I think the best way to understand this would be, you know, Descartes, okay, mind and matter. So, okay, sure, got two different substances, but how do they interact? Basically, by him separating the two from each other precludes any kind of interaction, and you need some kind of a third substance or some kind of intermediary in order for that to work at all. Because, you know, in fact, mind and matter are interacting all the time, and that's ultimately what a kind of dualism wouldn't be able to explain. And so I see, so Bergson, I think, obviously it's much better than Descartes. He doesn't have this, it's not, you know, a substance, and these things are different from each other as different substances. Their movements and their tendencies of duration, I guess. But then I think he needs some kind of I think just like a better articulation of exactly what that is the kind of medium in which these two different tendencies can be expressed, I guess. But I mean, even I think the best candidate is basically when he just talks simply about duration. But it's kind of strange because he seems to put duration almost all in the pole of life and whatnot, and kind of takes it away somewhat or diminishes it from the pole of matter. So that's where I think I have a hard time understanding that.
So, you know, so this may be just a word game of the kind that Bergson accuses other people of doing, but, you know, the way I thought about it, especially early in the book when he was more clearly monist, was that that he never names the whatever ground is, but that he just says something like, that ground is constituted by two simultaneously opposing moments, something like that. So that, you know, there is, so that life and matter are not two different, or they're not different ontological kinds, but they are different moments in a common ontological, I don't know what to say, ground or something, but that he never tries to name that unless maybe it's duration. And, you know, I thought of duration as being the emergence of being, where being is exactly life pushing through, or the, you know, the moment of life pushing past or through, crossing the moment of matter in whatever this ontological prime matter is, and that process is duration, and it is that process that gives rise to being. And so that's how I, you know, tried to, instead of saying you have to have a third principle for there to be express the way that these two different kinds can react, just thinking of them as two different I don't know if I want to say movements, but two different moments in one kind of stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess it's kind of the same problem because, you know, if he dedicates himself to a kind of absolute positivism, he almost has to name it as a something. But then I think the problem is that it's not a thing, it's not a something. And that's where I think what Merleau-Ponty is getting at is that uh, by kind of giving himself over to too much of a positivist account, that kind of takes away almost from the fluidity of his kind of process view, and that you need some kind of a more attenuated form of that by introducing, you know, this partial element of negativity into the whatever it is that allows it to have this kind of fluid process and this, you know, differentiation and movement and whatnot, but then also some kind of a unitary principle as well. But I don't know, I'm not sure. It's basically like I'm oscillating between kind of agreeing with Merleau-Ponty and then also just kind of agreeing with Bergson. Yeah, I don't even really know exactly what my position even is at this point.
Well, I don't really, I mean, I lean more toward Bergson, but I, you know, like you, I don't, well, there's very few things in general that I have a firm view of, but I mean, what I keep thinking is that maybe, like, that's what I meant, like maybe what I was saying was a mind game or a word game, sorry, to say that there is some unnamed ground that is the common carrier or whatever of these two modes of matter and life. You know, maybe that's just as senseless as saying that nothing exists. Um, but that's, I don't know, I think that's a general problem with these metaphysical terms. I guess it's the same problem that Heidegger has with the word nothing and so on. You're trying to talk about things that don't actually fit into language.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like you know, Deleuze with difference,
Yeah.
where, you know, the way that we think and our, especially in logic, you would have to basically put difference as a kind of identity, and that's why it's so hard to think, you know, difference in itself without just basically giving it an identity. And that's what, it's the same kind of thing. And then it's also, well, Heidegger actually said this himself, and he said basically, can we think difference in itself? Will we ever be able to think difference that isn't just something that's subsumed to a greater identity? And that's was a kind of a starting point, I think, well, one of many for Deleuze, who also is clearly taking a lot from Bergson in this respect. But yeah, I think it's the same kind of thing of these problems of, you know, trying to put these kind of intuitive insights, or I don't know what you would call them, into then a kind of discursive, dialectical, theoretical mode of communicating and theorizing and whatnot. It's kind of, I mean, that's what Bergson basically talks about in here. So yeah.
Yeah, in fact, because I know so little about Deleuze, I didn't say it, but I was tempted to say, like when I was talking about that, whatever that underlying commonality between life and matter is, I was tempted to say like Deleuze's difference, because, you know, to say pure difference is an oxymoron, because difference is always a relation between two or more things. But then, you know, I can think of that as something like the the ground of differentiation or something like, or a field. The reason I use a field analogy, a field of difference, is maybe because of my background as an electrical engineer, and thinking of electric fields and magnetic fields, which are, are continuous, but they're not undifferentiated. They're like fields of difference in a way. And so, I was thinking that maybe that's, maybe Bergson, and, maybe I don't know much about, haven't read Deleuze's book on Bergson, but maybe that's one of the inspirations for difference is something like, well, Bergson needs some fundamental principle of differentiation at the metaphysical base of things. And I think Nietzsche does too. And so that's why I without having studied him well, I wonder if Deleuze is again trying to take Nietzsche's vague metaphysical comments about will to power and then turn them into a rigorous metaphysics. But then, as I've confessed several times before, my interpretation of Nietzsche is beginning to more and more sound like Bergson. So,
yeah, that's. I think you're definitely getting to definitely kind of the heart of the matter there. Since so pure difference in itself, or pure difference as a concept, basically wouldn't make any sense because you would need difference between things, which then is a kind of, so it's basically that would be a kind of substance metaphysics where you basically need two different substances in order to have a difference. And I think exactly what he's trying to explain is the exact opposite. He's saying, no, actually, we don't need those two identities, those two substances, because what we could, at least in a Spinoza substance sense, could think of it is that it's actually this process of differentiation, this field of differentiation that gives rise to what we would then later on give a logical categorization of as a substance or an identity or whatnot. That So I think what Deleuze is kind of doing is, he's taking one element of Bergson, he's taking one element of Nietzsche, and then he's also taking an element of Kant also by talking about, this transcendental ground of these things, and he's kind of combining them all together to try to come up with a solution to this exact problem of trying to articulate this, which I think is the same thing that I definitely believe it's the same thing that Bergson, Nietzsche, and to a certain extent Heidegger also is trying to explain. I think you've probably I think you could say maybe Whitehead as well to a certain degree, but then Whitehead, I think he's kind of a little different from those other ones. He's got his own thing going in a way.
Well, there was a passage, you mentioned this earlier, toward the end on page 298 at the bottom. This is sort of oracular. I like that word, oracular. I use it in lectures sometime. I tell students, I'm being oracular. And they look at me like, what? I am speaking like an oracle. But down at the bottom, let's see, having foreign duration. Everything appears given once for all in all eternity, but we must accustom ourselves to, and this little phrase sounds like Heidegger. We must accustom ourselves to think being directly, without making a detour, without first appealing to the phantom of the not, which interposes itself between it and us. We must strive to see in order to see, and no longer see in order to act. So he was talking on the previous page, I guess, or maybe it's on the next page, is about how our intellect is all built around, I guess it's the next few pages, action. Then the absolute, it's, that just kind of freaks me out when he capitalizes that. Then the absolute is revealed very near us and in a certain measure in us. It is of psychological and not mathematical nor logical essence. It lives with us, like us, but in certain respects, infinitely more concentrated and more gathered up in itself, it endures. So that's sort of almost mystical passage. I don't know what to say about that. I just think it's it's like he's trying to give us a hint.
Yeah.
We're wondering about how would you experience this. It's like he's trying to give us a hint about that.
So the very next sentence, but do we ever think true duration?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of like the problem of philosophy here in terms of the philosophers we were just talking about, and for Bergson.
Yeah, right after that, the next sentence, here again, a direct taking possession is necessary. It is no use trying to approach duration. We must install ourselves within it straight away. This is what the intellect generally refuses to do, accustomed as it is to think the moving by means of the unmovable. So when he's, there he says, it's what the intellect generally refuses to do, accustomed as it is to think the moving by means of the unmovable. But on the previous page, he said we must accustom ourselves to think being directly. And so if he's really being consistent there, and it seems like he hinted at this before, there's a way to somehow put thought, let's see, you can't access intuition from thought, but you can access thought through intuition or something like that.
Yeah.
But he's trying to point us to a way of somehow, as he says here, installing ourselves in duration and then thinking from that, through that experience, I guess.
Yeah, because he talks about a dialectic kind of with dialectic, where dialectic more in the Platonic sense of just simply like discourse or whatnot, where he's saying that we need to really the wellspring of all this stuff is intuition, which is intuition of duration and the absolute and being itself. And then from there we can get, when we then kind of put that into thought and language, we're capturing some kind of partiality of it. And as much as it's able to kind of somewhat resemble the sort of fluidity of that intuition, then it's going to give us some kind of an accurate view in some degree. But then, yeah, if we do it the other way around, like the logical positives, we're using, logical categories and whatnot, then to try to think of time and whatnot, well, you're basically going to get, McTaggart's you're going to be able to think of time in any way because, time doesn't make sense. And, difference doesn't make sense, nothing doesn't make sense. So I think that's kind of the problem. And so I think Heidegger is similar in the sense that, he was Plato's whole thing where he's dividing being and becoming. He was putting becoming back into being by saying, that being itself is time for us, as beings that participate in being. It's through time that we do so. So that's why I see it as a kind of I probably wouldn't say that he's a process philosopher exactly. The interesting thing is that when he talks about the nothing, he's talking about it as a action and a process that it annihilates. And he points out that it's not an annihilation of all things, or a kind of symmetrical antagonism to everything. He's trying to explain some way of differentiation that allows being to be present, to be, I think it was, just kind of like a Gestalt kind of idea where you need some kind of a background for figure to emerge. And that's where I see kind of what he's getting at as being similar to some of these other philosophers, from Merleau-Ponty to Deleuze or whatnot, and trying to think of that there's some kind of a ground of process and differentiation or whatnot that is what gives us these the everyday world of solid substances and things like that, the empirical reality. That's where I see them as kind of trying to connect on this point, and they're all trying to kind of articulate it in different ways, but at the same time, I think even then their sort of intuition of it is also sort of different. A lot of difference going on, but also there's a kind of resonance and a principle of unity between them also. It sounds like a bunch of wordplay now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Kind of fun.
I mean, this is why analytics find it so easy to make fun of this stuff.
Yeah.
One of my difficulties when trying to contemplate these things in a less intellectual way is when I open my eyes and I look around me. I had this realization when, for some reason, when reading Kierkegaard in a 3-person seminar in graduate school, and I may have mentioned this before, but I realized that I am fundamentally blind to the future. That in reality, my experience is like this, like having my nose to the wall, and the wall is the present, and that's all I've got. And everything that I conceive of as the future is an imaginative exercise. But my actual experience is just like this. But then what one of the things that contributes to that illusion is my spatial vision. So that, I had this sort of this brain fart when I was driving down the road and I was looking ahead. And when you look in the distance, you're seeing things. It's as though I am seeing the future laid out in front of me, because I know that if I drive that direction or walk that direction, I will be there shortly. And so I have this illusory feeling, or this illusory sense, that I know the short-term future because I can see in the distance. But in fact, it's not that way. I am like blind to the future, except in imagination. And when I try to think about these kinds of things like we're talking about, like I try to think, what would it be to experience duration emerging in the very present? It's more difficult for me when I look out in the world, because I have this illusory sense that I'm experiencing more than just the present moment. And so I'm thinking, part of what Bergson wants me to do to be able to sort of engage this experience of duration is somehow experience the immediacy of the present emerging in this immediate moment. And that's it's difficult when I've spent my entire life thinking that I live in a giant space-time box, where I can kind of look
Mm.
back and see the past and look forward and see the future and so on. So
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really, we have that natural bias to think in those kind of spatialized categories to some extent. And that's really what we're kind of up against is, these kind of natural uh, tendencies to be able to think in terms that don't allow for an understanding of duration. Yeah, I think that's kind of what he's trying to get at, but then it's I think it's definitely, he's trying to kind of give us this push towards our own experience, definitely.
mm-hmm.
um but yeah, I'm not sure why I feel like I have some kind of reservation about that for some reason. I can't even articulate that part, because I think that part I definitely would agree with Bergson in the sense that, well, I guess to, you could also say that there's, I think it's more than just, like a cognitive kind of bias from being humans. I think it kind of extrapolates itself beyond that into, there's social forms that basically follow this too.
Mm-hmm.
And, you could see maybe some aspects of science as a kind of institution that wants to sort of continue some of these biases of spatialization to some degree. But then I'm not sure that's probably too absolute of a statement, because actually that was another thing that Merleau-Ponty criticized. So actually he criticized more Heidegger about this, and he praised Bergson about basically the role of science, because he was saying that science actually has kind of moved on from Newtonian physics and Cartesian ideas about extension and just duration or time just being simply the measure of a clock essentially. And that a lot of their arguments are still assuming a kind of Newtonian idea, like Bergson's idea of space is essentially the sort of absolute space of Newton.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I think he's aware, like, okay, he talks about there's new tendencies in science to talk about space and whatnot in different ways, but then again his argument is still kind of reliant on this sort of absolute limit of space as a kind of Cartesian thing that a lot of scientists still don't really believe anymore. But then I agree, I think Bergson would say that yeah, we still think that way though, and that's still very much, especially in our language. I think if you look at the way we were just trying to talk about nothing or whatever, there's very much, it seems like we haven't really gone past Aristotelian categories and trying to talk about stuff. And that's why it's so difficult to do with common language, and even the traditions of philosophical language that we get from the Western tradition and Plato and Aristotle and whatnot. And I think that's also why a lot of these philosophers were essentially trying to create their own vocabulary and trying to stir up a lot of the old sort of vocabulary and modes of thinking. That yeah, it's interesting that the ones that tend to try to think in like these radical new ways are also aware that language is a big part of this too.
Yep, that is for sure. Chase, do you know Dogen Zinji?
Yes. Actually, you know what? Do you know about Nishitani and the?
I well, not. I mean, I know about the Kyoto school. The only
Yeah.
the only thing I've ever read was An Inquiry into the Good by Kitaro Nishida, but I've not read anything by Nishitani.
Yeah, because I was just so I have his book Religion and Nothingness, because just thinking of all the nothingness stuff yesterday. I remembered this book because I was originally going to write an essay about. So actually, I did write this essay. It was basically a comparison of Heidegger's idea of nothingness with just like Eastern ideas of nothingness. And at first I was going to do it with this book, Nishitani's book. I obviously did not have time to read this, but so I just did it with like Taoism or something like that. But I was looking at this book yesterday, and well, he mentions Dogen, who I'm not exactly sure what his theory of time is exactly, but I know it's something somewhat similar. And one podcast I was listening to, they're saying basically that he was like a pretty revolutionary thinker, and it basically took until the 20th century in the West until they had thinkers that were able to like, come to some of his same understandings, I guess you could say. And I think the podcast specifically mentioned Heidegger and Deleuze, that basically it was until they came along that Western metaphysics was able to kind of catch on to some of the same stuff that Dogen was trying to.
Yeah, I've had several people refer me to, so Dogen, I don't know if it's a book or what it was, but there's a set of texts by Dogen called the Shobogenzo, and one of those is called UJI, which is usually translated the time being. And so I've heard people have told me I ought to read Dogen's Uji, or time being, in relation to Heidegger, but I haven't got around to that. So anyway.
Yeah, I think that's basically what this Nishitani book is about. So it's although it's definitely much more than just Dogen, but I know he definitely talks about Dogen in here, but it's kind of a comparison of I would say just like Mahayana Buddhist ideas with a lot of ideas from Western philosophies, specifically phenomenology and existentialism and whatnot. But so I thumbed through it pretty extensively yesterday. He talks a lot about Nietzsche and nihilism and whatnot in it. And also he talks a lot about Heidegger. He mentions some stuff about Bergson, Husserl, who else? Sartre. Yeah, Sartre's the other big one. But it seems to be what he's saying is that there's a relative nothingness that is a kind of nihilism that is almost a kind of like destructive force, I guess. And then there's absolute nothing, which he compares with emptiness, sunyata. And he's saying that really what we need to do is be able to think in terms of that, in terms of an absolute nothingness. Otherwise, we think basically in terms of the nihilistic ideas, I guess, something like that. I don't know, but either way, this book seems pretty amazing. Maybe a future seminar here.
I may have a copy of it. The former head priest at the Austin Zen Center purged the library a while back, and I picked up some books that he didn't like, and that may have been one of them. I have to go back and look. But I thought about bringing that into this discussion, the notion of non-duality as an experience of nothing in the sense of no thingness. I just don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've been told that there are people who interpret Heidegger's nothingness as that experience of no thingness, but I just don't know Heidegger enough to know, and I was just afraid that might be too far afield, and so I don't know.
Yeah, that was basically what my essay was about. Is I was making that exact point that this isn't a nothing that is a annihilation of beings or something like that. It's instead a kind of reinterpretation of what beings are as a kind of no thingness, and that the best way to understand this is basically to look at a lot of Eastern philosophy, because they're making a pretty similar point. Although when I reread my essay for the senior portfolio thing,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. My argument to make those connections was kind of, I'm not sure how much of it was like the problem of the ideas themselves, or if it was my delivery of them. I can't quite tell, but I was kind of like, oh, that last part was pretty bad. Like I think I had a pretty good understanding of some of the Heidegger stuff, but then it was mainly just we've read Being in Time, and I did a presentation on like the section on anxiety, and which reveals being in nothingness and whatnot. So I had a good understanding of that. But then Dr. Bauer, he's like, oh, you should look at this essay, what is metaphysics, because he talks more extensively about nothingness in there. So I basically I read that, and then like my essay is due, a few days later.
Oh.
And I'm trying to wrap my head around that while also trying to find a bunch of sources in like Eastern philosophy, which of course there's a huge amount of stuff there. And essentially it came out where like my essay was just kind of somewhat all over the place. At least that's how I feel about it. I got a 90 at least though, but either way, it's a very interesting topic. And I think there is definitely some validity to seeing it like that this idea of no thingness is definitely a big part of that. And I think that's a lot of process philosophy, as opposed to a substance philosophy, is trying to get at. They're trying to get at this no thingness, this kind of process or field of interaction and differentiation and whatnot. And that's where I've always seen a lot of similarities with a lot of Eastern ideas. They're not, I don't want to like totally collapse them into each other, like a lot of, like sort of New Age thinking would want to do, or perennialism and whatnot. There's definitely differences, but yeah, I like thinking still along like those kind of lines in terms of comparative philosophy and whatnot.
So I don't want to keep dragging you or keep you here, but do you think there is some? So you do. It sounds like you do think there might be some relation between Heidegger's notion of nothingness and the experience or notion of no thingness.
Yeah, I think there's a connection, definitely. Although there's definitely differences. So I believe Nishitani basically says that Heidegger ultimately is giving an ontology. He's talking about being, and what Nishitani was basically trying to say is that we instead, the nothingness is what is most primordial or original or fundamental and whatnot, in contrast to Heidegger, who's saying that being was the most fundamental and whatnot. But then it's kind of difficult because being and nothingness kind of work together in these really subtle ways, hard to figure out. But I think Nishitani, he was basically, in a lot of ways, he was kind of reacting to Heidegger's idea of nothingness and kind of trying to put it into dialogue with, ideas from Zen and Mahayana Buddhism and whatnot. So I think Nishitani is definitely right in saying that there's clearly some kind of a difference there. And at the same time, there's definitely a kind of resemblance, and they're kind of both onto the same thing to some degree. But yeah,
well, I should go back. I should look at that then, because I have a sense for what no thingness means, but so maybe that can be at least a way to move toward, closer to what Heidegger is thinking. And then I don't know if you saw the note Madeline just pointed out in the first book I ever had a seminar on was Nietzsche and Zen, and she points out that there's some stuff in there about that. So I need to go back and look at that also. Maybe that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, I've looked through that book before. I've never read it, but yeah, I'm definitely interested in looking at this myself. This book looks really interesting. If we weren't already reading Schelling, then I probably would have recommended this one, but who knows? Maybe for the spring. Although I need to keep. I need to stop doing these basically proposing all these seminars ahead of time. Otherwise, who knows? It would be 2024, and I'd already have all the books lined up.
Well, as long as you keep going to this one.
Yeah.
Although if you suffer the same fate as, if you start graduate school in a year and suffer the same fate as others, you may not be able to do that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that, if Brad couldn't do it, then
yeah,
I don't think I could. So,
and Declan had that problem, and Sean would kind of come in and out, but he wasn't able to stay consistently, and Declan wasn't either. So yeah, it's a tough job to do both.
Yeah, definitely. I think probably the only way is if I was able to get them to align with each other, where say the seminar book was the same book I was reading in one of the graduate classes or something like that.
That'd be great. Then you could sort of import information for us. So, okay. Well, thank you very much, guys. Nice to have someone to talk to.
Yeah. Talking to people.
Yeah, well, sort of. All I'm talking to is a snake biting its tail and a word that says Madeline. So. Okay, we'll talk to you next time.
All right, see you.